We are 1 week away from a UK election that could send the British Isles into unchartered waters. Incumbent David Cameron's been touting a recovery stronger than on the continent. So, why are the ruling Conservatives in a dead heat with Labour? Worse, his party may win the most seats, but find itself in the opposition. Part of it is down to the bottom line. The southeast is prospering, the rest of the nation less so. But the growing gap between the haves and have-nots is only part of the story. Yes, there's a chance Ed Miliband's Labour Party could form the next government, but he's braced for a rout in one of the left's traditional bastions, Scotland, where to rule, he'll have to court the Scottish National Party. The SNP may have lost a recent referendum on independence, but it may come out of the election stronger than ever. That is breeding resentment in England, and there's identity politics of a different sort with the emergence of the anti-Europe, anti-immigrant UKIP party after the rise of the far right in France and in Northern Europe, and the emergence of new anti-austerity parties in places like Greece and Spain. Could Britain's election further highlight the fragmentation of traditional political fault lines? If so, why? Today in the France 24 debate, are we headed for a less united kingdom? And with us, he covered the last general election for the French news agency AFP. Guy Jackson, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Welcome as well to France 24 Europe editor Christophe Robit.
Hello.
Who's here in our studio. From Stirling in Scotland, Craig McAngus, research fellow at the Centre on Constitutional Reform. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
By day, he's a professor of English. Luke Thompson, also a stand-up comedian here in Paris. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. The election's too close to call. The winner is slated to reap a record low percentage of the overall vote. The stakes are very high for both Britain and Europe. And yet, with 1 week to go, 1 in 5 voters either has yet to pick a candidate or could still change his or her mind. Guy, how would you characterize this campaign?
I think this campaign has been truly an exhibition, a demonstration that Britain has become a multi-party country. I mean, as 2010, it was really Labour and the Conservatives, a two-party thing, and people were talking about then with the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats forming a coalition government with the Conservatives. It became a three-party state. Well, certainly now you can look at as many as 5. If you're looking at UKIP, the SNP in Scotland, the Tories, Conservatives, Labour and Lib Dems, you've got 5 there. So I think this is, traditional voting patterns are changing. Votes are being taken away by other parties. That's how I would characterise it. Britain moving to a multi-party state. That's definitely how I would see it.
So there's been this splintering, and yet some say they're a little bit underwhelmed by the rhetoric they've heard on the campaign trail.
Yes, it's interesting because the Britain's economy has bounced back a lot better than France. There's no doubt about it. Britain, I mean, look, immigration's an issue. Why is immigration an issue for Britain? It attracts a lot of immigrants because the economy is good. Afterwards, you can look at why. I mean, David Cameron is not a politician who attracts an awful lot of passionate support. That's true. And neither, though, is Ed Miliband. Has to be said. He's not a Tony Blair figure, whatever you think of Tony Blair now. Tony Blair in 1997, when he swept in, there was a feeling, I think you're right, Luke, there was a feeling of a new start.
Yeah.
Certainly you're not going to get that this time. So I think Cameron is not a great politician in terms of a campaigner. That's true. Actually, Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP leader, has emerged as the surprise. Well, surprise. She campaigned, of course, alongside Alex Salmond in the referendum, which they lost. But I think it's clear to say that Nicola Sturgeon has been one of the surprise packages of this election.
I was going to say the one place where we can definitely say that there's a chance of big time change is Scotland. Craig McAngus, what have you found? What's the reason people are voting SNP?
Well, that's a good question. You've probably seen the opinion polls recent opinion polls have the SNP upwards of 50% in terms of share of the vote. which could potentially, although it would be a very good result, give them all 59 seats in Scotland. Why the SNP doing well? Labour and the SNP have got an electoral symbiotic relationship in Scotland. So if the SNP are doing well, then Labour are obviously not doing so well. So to understand why the SNP are doing well, you also have to understand why Labour aren't doing well. But to stick to the SNP, in 1999, Scotland got a devolved parliament, and that gave the SNP a relevance that it never had before. Because previously the SNP was competing at UK general elections. The largest amount of seats ever won was 11 in October 1974. But it was basically a protest party. It would never get the chance to use governmental office and and show its governing credentials. With devolution, it gives the party a new relevance. It's then got an opportunity to become a party of government. And of course, the SNP have been in government in Scotland since 2007. They won the election in 2007, albeit by one seat over Labour. They formed a minority government and they did very well. They went to the 2011 election in Scotland and they won a majority in an electoral system, by the way, that's designed to not give them a majority. So clearly, support for the SNP has been there for a while, and support for Labour in Scotland has been gradually declining. But then we got the independence referendum. And it seems that the decline of the Labour Party and the rise of the SNP in a UK general election setting has really exploded with the referendum. And the referendum,
even though the pro-independence camp lost by 10 points?
Well, yes, the pro-independence camp did lose, but you have to understand that 45% of the electorate voted yes. And opinion polling is telling us that upwards of 80–85% of that 45% intend to vote for the SNP. Now, that loses you a referendum, 45%. But if you're getting 45% in a general election with the first-past-the-post system that the UK operates, you're going to be doing pretty well. The other thing is that what's happened in Scotland is that the referendum engaged people in Scotland in a way that has never happened before, at least not in living memory.
All right, so it's energized voters. Would you say, though, that some of it is down to personality? That is to say that, well, people like Nicola Sturgeon a lot more than they like Ed Miliband.
Yeah, if you look at research that was done into why the SNP have been electorally successful, you find that one of the variables, if you like, is leadership. That they are perceived as having a competent and able leadership and a strong leadership, and more importantly, a leadership that stands up for Scottish interests and solely stands up for Scottish interests. And they had that with Alex Salmond as leader, but he's now stepped aside. And Nicola Sturgeon, I mean, you know, she's come onto the UK scene. She's almost exploded on the scene, or that seems to be the understanding. But she's been on the scene in Scottish politics for a long time, and people who watch Scottish politics knew a long time ago that this was a woman who had a big future in politics ahead. Okay, I wouldn't have imagined this happening, what's happening just now. But she's had important ministerial portfolios in Scotland. And when Alex Salmond became leader of the SNP for the second time in 2004, he didn't have a seat in the Scottish Parliament. He was an MP. So who had to lead the SNP group in the Scottish Parliament? It's Nicola Sturgeon. So those who follow Scottish politics know fine well that this woman has
are less surprised by it. A little bit more so in the rest of the UK. Luke Thompson, as an Englishman, what do you think about all this?
Well, it's like in some of the UK press, there have been these statements, like, for example, that Scotland or the SNP are holding the country to ransom.
Was it the former Prime Minister John Major who said that she will create merry hell? Yeah,
it was in the Times. This word was used, ransom, and also the Telegraph, I think, as well. And it just makes you think, really, ransom? So they're kidnapping the country, exactly, using legitimate means, apparently. It's just interesting that for some people in England, this is viewed as almost a sort of criminal, kidnapping of the country. But isn't that just part of the democratic process? Personally, myself as an English person, I look at the influence of SNP and I think, well, that's not a huge shock or surprise. I wonder where does the fear come from about the influence of SNP on the whole of the UK? Because all this sort of dramatic language is being used. I just wonder what are people so scared of?
Well, I think what is striking about the SNP and so special about the SNP is that they only operate in Scotland. So the likelihood of seeing a Labour SNP coalition is quite unpalatable to most English persons, because they don't want Scottish MPs who only represent the interests of Scotland to rule from Westminster. That's, I think, part of the reason.
And who've said that they won't take part in a coalition government. So in other words, they'll be able to pull the trigger whenever they feel like it and bring down the government.
I think that I was reading up on this as I'm now based, in Paris. But I mean, Miliband has made statements to say he will not have a formal coalition with the SNP. Of course, this is politics. That doesn't mean that they can't. SNP and Labour work together to keep the Tories out of various seats. But I mean, they probably won't need that, because the SNP are going to win, it seems, most of the seats in Scotland. I think more interesting is in Westminster, in the London Parliament, in votes, the SNP could give its tacit support to Labour. And I think that's the key. That's where, I mean, if SNP has got 50 seats, for instance, in Westminster, in the London Parliament, we need to remember there's a Scottish Parliament. This is the Westminster Parliament where they're voting.
I'm haunted by something you said at the outset of our conversation, Guy, which is that David Miliband. Sorry, excuse me. And I was thinking David. I was thinking of David Cameron. Hence the confusion. You were saying about David Cameron not being this energizing, overwhelming candidate. Yeah. He's more popular though than his own party. To a certain degree. Christophe Robic, the man that you've covered, attending all those EU summits. Is he someone who can energize?
Well, seen from Brussels, he's a bit of a comedian. Obviously, Brussels is not his favourite city, I understand. So every time he travels to Brussels, he has to make an impression. He's very dynamic, of course, but I think it's not only about Cameron, it's about the election. It's so tight, it's so unpredictable that the main characters are playing it so safe. It's a very, it's a very cautious election. And in this globalized world where the social media plays such an important role, you don't want to be caught saying something wrong. So it's best to be vague, it's best to be dull, rather than say something wrong. And I think it's not only a British thing. I covered the German elections. We saw pretty much the same in France, although France is always a bit more dramatic. But as a rule, politicians have to be extremely cautious, and that makes them dull and boring. And that's a good thing, of course, for maverick politicians like Nigel Farage or other parties like Nicola Sturgeon, who really came across as authentic, spontaneous and passionate. Maybe Mr. Cameron and Mr. Miliband are very spontaneous and passionate, but they can't afford to show it.
All right, to boost their prospects, candidates searching for ways to, at the same time, avoid any unscripted disasters, but also pick up on those voters that they need, like the young vote. Hence, we had scenes like the Labour leader sitting down with comedian Russell Brand, who'd argued previously for staying home on Election Day.
It seems that it's very difficult at a domestic level to leverage serious influence. So when we have a party...
It's just not true.
So you are in a position to confront these powerful organisations, the financial industry, transnational corporations, say for example...
An exchange in an informal setting. Right. And to rate Miliband's performance, here's one precinct that was heard from this week.
If you can understand me, it's better.
Okay, fine.
Right, say for example, right, like the sort of average UK worker pays 20% normal tax, right? Sure. Amazon paid 0.05% on 4 billion sales.
Yeah, we've got to.
Right? Ed Miliband, hang out with Russell Brand. He's a joke. This is not funny. This is about the election. This is about our future. This is about jobs. It's about the economy. It's about the recovery. I haven't got time to hang out with Russell Brand. This is more important. These are real people. This is what this election is all about.
All right, this is part of the reason that we roped you in here today, Luke. Yeah. As a stand-up comedian, what role do stand-up comedians have on the campaign trail?
I think lots of roles. One of them is just to make fun of the whole thing, just try and make it a bit funny, but also just to, stand-up is a sort of forum where people can say whatever they want. I think Russell Brand is a very interesting person because he has managed to voice opinions that lots of people have. which are not necessarily being voiced in conventional media and things like that. So he's quite an interesting person. David Cameron was sort of a bit dismissive there. He's saying Ed Miliband spoke to Russell Brand, but he's a joke. He's not really a joke. I mean, he's a comedian. It doesn't make him a joke. But I think that it was actually a clever move by Ed Miliband to go on to the Trues. That's Russell Brand's show. I think it was a really, really good move, and it worked really well for him, I think. I saw it yesterday, and I thought that he handled it really, really well.
And there you saw the reaction of Cameron. He's got those people behind him that somewhat looked like a construction site. Traditional politicians are really having a hard time getting around their heads around these new ways of communicating.
Yeah, because what we saw was all, staged and prepared. It wasn't a spontaneous meeting on the street of London. It's very difficult, and if you are a politician, you have to be very careful, because anything can be recorded, it can be posted, can be commented, and you don't want that to ruin your whole campaign. So it is very difficult, but the danger is that by appearing so calculated and so out of touch, you actually end up favouring other parties.
What did you think of David Cameron's
answer? One of AFP's reporters in our London office today said, Cameron's having to really get into it now. He actually went outside today to do a campaign event for the first time. I mean, I think actually there he was actually in a factory. And the rolled-up sleeves is quite hilarious. I mean, this is an old Etonian from the school that Prince William went to, the elite of Britain, sort of standing there with his sleeves rolled up as if he's a worker. It's quite funny, really. As you say, it's so staged.
But we also saw Ed Miliband wearing the suit and tie when he's sitting with Russell Brand.
Well, in a way, perhaps good for Ed Miliband, you could say, because he's not changing his image. He didn't put on a T-shirt to meet Russell Brand. But
just imagining what kind of T-shirt he would have worn. Yeah. It would have looked.
I think that Miliband's problem is that most people expected his brother David Miliband to be elected, and David Miliband is
He's more to the centre.
He's more to the centre. He was linked with New Labour, that was Blair. Ed Miliband is slightly odd. When he came in, he's a policy wonk, as they call him. He looks slightly odd. The Guardian cartoonist, I think, portrays him as a panda. Big eyes, and he had a very nasal voice. He had an operation on his nose, in fact, partly because of that. But I wonder if the British people, they do vote for, unlike some other countries, a prime minister. They vote for a prime minister often, and I do wonder if people are starting to come round to the idea that was previously, very unlikely, that Miliband could be a prime minister. They see him as a prime minister.
We're going to look at the image of these candidates and at what lies ahead when we return. Stay with us. It's the France 24 debate.